Hello and welcome to the palatial home studio of Parkside Alliance Church. I call it my home studio. This is my house. I use my den in my office area to do sometime my sermons, record my sermons. I record them at the church as well, and try to make a difference. My name is Pastor Kevin Hogan, and I'm glad you joined us for one of these sermons that we make available each and every week on our Facebook page and on our YouTube page as well. We are looking at the stories that occur to Jesus during the last week of his life before his crucifixion, found in the Gospels. We're going to be looking at some of his teaching, some of his parables, but we're also going to be looking at some of the incidents that occurred. Here's a really cool one that occurs in Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 to 22, where some people gang up together against Jesus in order to trap him. Probably a very familiar passage, or at least portions of it might be familiar to you, but we want to look at it together. Matthew 22, 15 to 22 is the text we're going to look at, but we're going to try to ask ourselves the question. This is a really difficult world we live in. It's politically charged. There's all kinds of issues going on around us. I could begin to name them all, but I think you're aware of them. You just go onto social media or whatever, and you see that they're talked about over and over and over again, these large issues. And the question is, how do we as believers exist in such a controversial world? How do we live in such a controversial world? Well, the groups that join together to trap Jesus with this question that they're going to ask, they are trying to invite Jesus into their political issues and their religious issues at the same time. And Jesus' answer is not only brilliant, but it also helps us to understand what is one way that we can approach some of the difficult circumstances that we face in this world. Well, the story is of those that came to ask Jesus whether it was appropriate to pay taxes to Caesar or not. Let me read the text for you. It's Matthew 22, verses 15 to 22, where it says, "The Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. 'Teacher,' they said, 'we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?' But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, 'You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin that you're using to pay the tax.' They brought him a denarius. He asked them, 'Whose image is this, and whose inscription?' 'Caesar's,' they answered. And he said to them, 'So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's.' And when they heard this, they were amazed, so they left him and they went away." So, how do we exist in this very tricky, complicated world where there's all kinds of opinions and ideas, not only politically, but medically and philosophically and materially, all the different things that we face in this world? Well, let's start with this story. This story is one where those who are opposed to Jesus are getting very desperate. You see, Jesus had just arrived a few days before this to a great reception in the city. He'd come into town riding on a donkey, and the people had lined the streets and thrown their cloaks on the road and waved palm branches, and they'd welcomed Jesus as king. Now, the Pharisees didn't like this. Neither did any of the other groups who were in charge. And there's lots of different groups in Israel at this time. So let's be really clear. The political situation in Israel is that they are ruled by a Roman emperor by the name of Tiberius. Roman emperor who exerted his authority and will militarily on the world. Israel was in subjection and had to pay taxes to Caesar. And that's why, for instance, the empire expanded, so they could have more resources and more wealth. That's why governments do that even today. So you have the people of Israel. They have their own king. He's one of the Herods. He doesn't have a lot of authority, but he is still a descendant of Herod the Great. And then, of course, we have the religious leaders in the different groups there: Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, Levites, priests, etc., etc. Those who were in authority and were part of the religious ruling groups. Now, of course, we know that the Pharisees were the ones that most often came to Jesus with questions or raised objections to things that Jesus said and did. Just read the Gospels. You'll see it occur time after time after time. But they're getting desperate. And in this story, we have the Pharisees joining forces with the Herodians. Now, the Herodians were a political group. They believed that Herod, a descendant of Herod, should reign over the kingdom of Israel. And in doing so, they were kind of agreeing with what was happening with the Romans as well. They were a political group. There were other political groups that we're aware of at this time. There was the Zealots, and the Zealots were the ones that believed that the Roman government should be overthrown by force. One of Jesus' disciples was a zealot. So they were a political party, and they wanted to restore a descendant of Herod on the throne of Judea. They also were political foes of the Pharisees, because the Pharisees wanted a spiritual kingdom, a religious kingdom, to restore the kingdom of David. And so these guys then joined together, hypocritically, of course, in order to speak against Jesus. Now, or to ask a question of Jesus. I always think about this. I think about, what was it like in the back rooms of those where the powers that be gathered, and you would put all their heads together, and they would think, how can we trip up this Jesus? He's very popular and we don't like him. We need to get rid of him. In fact, they wanted him to die. So how in the world can we then get rid of Jesus? And the only thing they could think of was to challenge him on some of these issues. And here is one question that they came up with, which is actually a pretty tricky and smart question. I'll explain that in a second. But the Pharisees and the Herodians, two political enemies, or enemies in thought and idea, got together and they came to Jesus together to ask this question. Now, before they asked the question, they ply Jesus with these buttery words. They try to butter him up. They say, you're a man of integrity, Jesus. You're a rabbi. You're a teacher. You teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. We're acknowledging that you're different and that you're amazing. You're not swayed by others. Like, they're buttering him up. Because you pay no attention to who they are. Like, you don't care about these things. It's pretty obvious. But here's a question. Here's the question. What is your opinion? And here's the question that they have been waiting to ask Jesus. Because if Jesus answers yes, one group wins. If he answers no, the other group wins. And it's a yes or no question. Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar? Yes or no? Well, Jesus, as it says in the story, knows their evil intent. He calls them hypocrites, and he says, "Why are you trying to trap me?" And then Jesus asks for a coin, the coin that they would use to pay tax to Caesar. And he looks at the coin and he asks them, he says, "Whose image is on here? Whose inscription is on here?" Well, it was clearly Caesar's. And that was the answer. So they then then he was able to answer the question. Well, let me tell you why this question that they're asking Jesus is a potentially dangerous question for Jesus. Here's why. The Herodians were a group of Jews who, unlike most Jews, were favorable to the rule of the Herods, and therefore, indirectly, to the rule of Rome. They had little in common with the Pharisees, but the two groups were willing to cooperate in order to trap Jesus. If Jesus answered yes to this question, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar? If Jesus replied yes, the Pharisees would be able to accuse him before the Jewish people as being a traitor. But if he answered no, the Herodians would be able to accuse him before the Roman authorities as being a person who was committing treason. So if he says yes, the Pharisees can call him a traitor. If he says no, then the Herodians can have him tried for treason. But Jesus doesn't answer yes or no. He looks at the coin and he says, whose coin is this? It's Caesar's. And he says this. So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Jesus gives the perfect answer. Don't we all dream of having the right answer for when somebody asks us a question? Oh, if I could just answer it right. If I could just get them with the answer, I could just truth bomb them. If I could think clearly enough and make the correct statement here. Well, we are very interested in these days, especially on social media, of truth bombs. We want to get people. We want those gotcha moments where we can say, aha, there's the truth, if you think about it this way. And yes, Jesus does put these people in their place, but he didn't do it to make a political point, and he didn't make it to make them feel worthless. He did it to show them there was a much better way. And wouldn't it be interesting for Christians in North America today to be so different from the world that everything that we did could show that we have a better way? That we have a better way than any political party. We have a better way than any form of government. We have a better way. We have God's way. And Jesus says, render unto Caesar, or give to Caesar what belongs to him, acknowledging that human governments do exist and serve a purpose. But he said the most important thing is to give to God what is God's. He has shown them a better way. He took their eyes off of the present and he put their eyes on the eternal. You see, there's so much more at work here than just trying to answer this political question. There's so much more here at work than trying to trick Jesus and to get him in trouble. Jesus is establishing a new covenant, one in which transformed believers live in a world that is not their home. They are now citizens of heaven. And once you become part of God's family, we no longer belong here on earth. And the most important authority is not whoever is in charge of the country or the province or the city that we live in, but God himself. We are now citizens of heaven. And that we recognize that we are not part of the temporary, we're actually part of the eternal. And in a world where we are often politically, culturally, and emotionally at odds with everything that is happening, or a lot of the things that are happening, guess what? We are okay. How do we get along here? Well, I don't have all the answers, but I believe that Jesus helps us in this story to take our eyes off the temporary, put it on the eternal. Kingdoms will come and go. Tiberius, who was emperor of Rome at that time, the most powerful nation on earth, Tiberius, within a few years, himself would die, and a guy by the name of Caligula would take over. You may have heard of him. Eventually, a couple of emperors later, there's a guy by the name of Nero, who actively persecuted Christians. There's another emperor that's going to come who's going to completely destroy Jerusalem. You know, all these things are just temporary. No nation, no king, no government, form of government will last for eternity, but the kingdom of God will. And we are part of that kingdom. So how do we get along here? I don't know that I have all the answers, but I do know that it's mostly has a lot to do with perspective. Here it is. And I love this about Jesus. You know, he didn't shame them, these guys that came and asked the question. He didn't belittle them. He helped them to lift their eyes off the temporary and put it on the eternal. He made them think about what was important. And perhaps when they were walking away, they were thinking, you know, I guess we should pay taxes to Caesar. He's the one that's in charge. But where have our hearts been? Give unto God what is God's, Jesus said. He helped them to understand that God was the most important thing. We belong to God, but we live in this world. We are called by Jesus to be salt, preserving and flavoring in this world. We are called to be light, showing the truth clearly in the midst of darkness. We are redeemed children who live in a fallen world. You know, Peter said it so beautifully. And Peter, who was probably there when Jesus was asked this question, and he probably wondered to himself, oh no, that's a great question. How is Jesus going to answer this question? And he saw what Jesus said and listened to what Jesus said. And then he saw what Jesus did on the cross. Peter, on reflecting on all this later, says in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11 and 12, he says, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul." Then he says this, "Live such good lives among the pagans, though they may accuse you of doing wrong. They may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." Live such good lives among the pagans. Gerhard Vischer puts it this way. You know what it means? The story helps us to understand that we can be involved and should be involved in the politics of where we live. But we must bear God's message in the middle of this public life. We must be the salt of the earth. We must carry those who rule in our prayers. Scripture tells us that over and over again. We must perform a service of love even to the tyrants among them, by warning them in the name of God and by communicating to them the truth that has been entrusted to us. Gerhard finishes by saying, we must go forth into this area of life, not to make it his, but precisely because it is his. Jesus had a better way, and he has a better way. And you may be struggling right now with what's going on in the world, with people that are so diametrically opposed with each other, and you find yourself in one camp or the other, and all we're doing is slinging what we consider to be truth bombs back and forth. We're trying to win the argument. We're trying to win the day. My friends, we belong to God. We are different. Our citizenship is in heaven. It is not here on earth. And when we truly understand that and live our lives graciously and kindly in those ways, we can make a big difference in this broken world. Live such good lives among the pagans, Peter says, that even though if they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. We are called to be people who love and pray and live graciously in a fallen world. I hope you find encouragement from these words. I hope you find encouragement from this story of Jesus. And thank you for being here today. Until the next time we gather, go in God's peace.